And for me personally, I've found over the years that I like the way a 5, 6, 8, 9, 10 pounder tugs on the end of the line and comes to the boat and takes a photo. For me, that's a lot more satisfying than if I'm out there taking a picture of a little 10, 12, 11, 13-inch bass. And one of the things that I've found is that these big bass, like humans, we have certain traits that we follow throughout our life cycle. And that's something very important to understand when you're out there looking for bass, is that they are very, very predictable creatures. They have a life cycle that is dependent and based around that spawning cycle where they move throughout their house, being a lake, a river system, the California Delta. They live in a given area, and they have certain places throughout that year that they travel within that area, just like you and I do within our homes. The most important place for those fish year in and year out is in that springtime when they're in the bedroom. When they're in the bedroom and they move up there and they start building those beds, those fish are up shallow, they're reproducing for the next year. The whole life cycle of bass depends upon that, and it's based on that time of year. Throughout the year, they're building up body fat, they're developing the eggs, they're staying out in deep water in the wintertime, they're moving up, they're transitioning into the bedroom, they lay their eggs, and then they move right back on out. When they go into the maternity ward, they kind of sit there and hang out and recover from the spawn. They got the den and the places they go hang out in the summertime, and then they go through the whole cycle in the fall, back to the winter, and so forth. Once you understand and get an idea, a basic idea of that life cycle, you're going to be able to figure out where those bass should be on a yearly basis. And you can count on year in and year out, day to day, that those fish are going to be doing that particular and that same pattern all the way through. Now, we may have some situations on a given day, just like us. You know, when the sun goes down, we kind of start to get tired. When the sun comes up, we kind of act up and get lively and start moving around. When the rains come in and it gets a little overcast and blurry, we kind of go, you know, I really won't want to go out and play. Bass are kind of the same way. They will adjust day to day and have certain reactions to changes within their environment. So when we're out there attempting to catch these fish, we've got to come to an understanding that there are 3 modes that these fish are going to be in at all times. They're either going to be in an active feeding mode, where they're just going to be clocking and eating everything in sight, because a bass is a very, very aggressive feeding machine. They're a very active predator, and they're constantly looking to something to eat. They're also very protective of their area and their space. So one of the things that I always do when I'm out there fishing is I'm always out there trying to trigger strikes. Okay? I'm looking for fish that are actively feeding, and if they aren't actively feeding, I'm trying to fish in such a fashion that I'm triggering strikes. Because with their curiosity, you can get their attention, and you can take a positive feeding fish who's going to clock your bait on the fall instantly, and that's how you can tell. If you've got a positive feeding fish, those fish are up shallow, they're up on a dining room table, they're eating. As your bait falls before it hits the bottom, bang, they're going to grab it. But those negative feeding fish, they're just kind of sitting there. They're not really hungry, but they're very protective of the areas that they're in. And you can get a bait and kind of move it through their zone and get their attention and trigger a strike. And that's what I like to do, is I like to get baits and put it in front of those bass that are triggering strikes. Now, any of us, when they're in that positive feeding mode, we throw that bait up in there, they're going to eat it. Any one of us can catch. That's bass fishing 101, easy, guys. Okay? If you're out there catching fish, right away, you found yourself a group of very active, positive eating fish. When those fish get in that neutral or negative mode, where they're really not looking for something to eat, that's where the challenge is in trying to get them to feed. And being able to put a bait in front of them that gets their attention and trigger those strikes so we can put them in the boat is the key. And that's the difference between the guys that are consistently successful and those that aren't. Now, the other thing that I like to apply these fish to humans is that I always like to think in presenting them a bait that they're going to more likely eat than something else. It's kind of like, as I mentioned, I'm looking for those bigger fish all the time, all the time. I never go out looking to catch 10, 12, 13, 14-inch fish. I want to catch 4-pounders. I want to catch 3-pounders, 5 3-pounders if I'm in a tournament. I want to catch that 10-pounder. Well, we all want that 10-pounder on the wall. You're not going to get too many 10-pound fish fishing a 4-inch worm, okay? And the reasoning, my concept and idea behind that is, bass are like humans. If I walked up to you, sir, and offered you a hot dog or a T-bone, which one are you going to take? You're going to take the T-bone every time. Yet if I go to this little juvenile young lady right here and offer her a hot dog or a T-bone, which one do you think she's going to take? She wants that hot dog, because that's what she's familiar with eating. Well, folks, bass are the same way. You offer them hot dogs, the juvenile fish are going to clock and eat them all day long. You offer them T-bones, they don't know about those T-bone baits. But those bass that are 7, 8, 10, 12, 14, 22 pounds, they know all about T-bones. They know what that T-bone does to their system. And one of my favorite T-bone baits is a jig and pig. If I could get bass to eat a crawdad imitating jig on a year-round basis, I would never have a need to throw another bait, because I have caught more fish over 10 pounds and more fish in that 6 to 9 pound range on this one bait alone than any other bait in my arsenal. And because of that, I've developed a very strong level of confidence in this bait. I'm imitating a crawdad, okay? I'm keeping that bait on the bottom and I'm moving and bouncing it like a crawdad as it scoots on the water. Now, one of the things that I do, I like moving this bait really fast, which is completely different than what most guys will tell you. You know, I gotta fish a jig in the wintertime, I gotta fish it real slow. The water's cold, the bass's metabolism is slow, they want something moving very slow. Well, that's all fine and dandy for those guys who want to fish at that pace in 30 to 60 foot of water. Me, I don't have the patience to do that. I want to trigger strikes, I want to cover as much water as I possibly can, and I want to get the attention of those bigger, better quality fish. So I like to get that crawdad down there, and I like to keep it moving all the time. Now, one of the things I noticed a long time ago when I was watching and studying crawdads in my tank at home is that they would do something, and I had bass in this tank with these crawdads. And anytime that crawdad noticed that there was a bass close by, they never just sat there and said, "Come and get me." No, never, not one time, okay? What they do is they go into a defensive posture. Those claws, that's the only protection that they've got. That's the only warning signal that those crawdads have got to try and fend off that bass. So what I try and do when I'm fishing that jig and pig, okay, you've got that piece of pork rind on there, you've got those 2 extra legs, that's a representation of that crawdad and his claws. When you get that bait out there and it hits the bottom, you'll see when that crawdad hits it, when that jig hits the bottom, as I pop that thing, those claws, they start to wave. Okay, they start to wave. They get to waving, and I like to keep it popping and waving. So it's imitating that crawdad. When you get that kind of wave out of that bait, you're going to get that bass. One of those bass that's sitting down there is going to see that thing, and he's going to go, "Oh, that looks like something I need to eat." Next thing you know, boom, bang, set the hook, fish in the boat, okay? Now, a couple things I like to do to improve and enhance my jig fishing is, one, I need to always be in tune with the bait. I need to know exactly what that bait is down there doing on the bottom. So because of that, I'm using a 6'6", 7-foot heavy action high graphite rod, about 43 million modulus, 47 million modulus, heavy action rod. I like something with 10 guides on it, and I like using fluorocarbon line. I think fluorocarbon line is one of the most sensitive lines that you can have in your hand next to braid. Braid's also very, very sensitive and a good line to use, but it has some inherent properties that I don't particularly care for. It's not very abrasion resistant. You get it and you're fishing around rocks and barnacles and rebar like we have out on the Delta, it frays and it breaks off the palm. You set the hook, there's no stretch, you lose your fish, possibly a fish of a lifetime. The other thing is with braid, those fish can see it. When you're fishing extremely gin clear water, those fish, you better believe, in a lot of instances, are line shy. They can detect and see that line. I like using the fluorocarbon line because it doesn't refract light. Otherwise, the light passes right through it. It's nearly invisible, if not completely invisible, to the fish in the water. I find that I get a lot more strikes when they can't see that line. Plus, with the 10 guides in the fluorocarbon, now I got 10 points on my rod where that super sensitive line is touching my blank. I like keeping that line nice and taut and bouncing as I go along. Just bouncing and bouncing and bouncing. And the other thing that I like about the fluorocarbon is due to its properties, its density. When I'm on a slack line, okay, and that fish strikes that bait, it's telepath through that. It's like piano wire, okay? Whereas in braid, if you've got a big loop and bow in your line, you're never going to feel that strike. It doesn't telepath the strike to your bait unless you've got a taut line, okay? And I fish a lot of my jigs on a very slack line as I'm bouncing it and hopping it and moving it so fast. I've always got a bow on there. So that's the other thing, is that I can see and feel those strikes a lot better with that fluorocarbon line. Now, most of the time, I'm using, when the water temperature is below 60 degrees, is when I like using the pork. That seems to be when the fish are more susceptible to grabbing that bait. And I can't explain why exactly, other than through my own experiences, and that everything that I've ever read is that in cold water you want to use pork. I started using that theory, and it's worked out extremely well for me. When it gets up to around 62, 63 degrees in the summertime, I'll change up. Most fish are now, they've been up on the beds, they're up spawning. April, May, June, July, they're already done spawning. Bluegills are starting to move up onto the bank. They're not only, moving into the bass's bedroom, okay, attacking their eggs. They're looking to eat their eggs. They're also in the summertime moving up to spawn. The bass's attitude starts to change. They can care less about crawdads at this time of year. Now, those bluegills, the bream, the various bait fish that we have in our rivers and water systems now take on that brown and purple look. I'm using brown jigs and mostly with purples and black and blue colorations. Okay, now I go to the single tail grubs. This is the Yamamoto 164 5-inch single tail grub. It's what we call electric grape, the old electric grape. Now I'm imitating that bluegill that's down there swimming around the areas. With this one, I tend to keep it moving a little bit more faster than that jig. I just kind of keep swimming it through the strike zone. Again, looking for those reaction strikes from those fish that are out there, protecting nests, or they're already done spawning, and they're up looking for those bluegills that are up there on the shallow flats themselves spawning. This is an exceptional bait when up at Clearly, almost year-round, and you're out there fishing on the rock piles. Even in the wintertime, up there, I will use this particular bait more than I will the pork, because what happens is that big single tail, you can see as I move that bait through the water, that single tail gets to turning, and it's doing two things. It's doing two things that I really like. First off, as it's turning, it's creating motion and water movement. These fish, they can feel that movement coming through the water, and their lateral lines, they pick up the vibrations of that bait coming through the water. It's like some other bait fish that's swimming through the water, whose tail's going back and forth. And down in those low light conditions, you can better believe those big bass, they're using those extrasensory perceptions of that lateral line. They can't rely solely on sight. Okay, they rely a lot on their other senses as well. So that big 5-inch single-tailed grub really helps to imitate and give those bass something to look for as that bait is swimming through the strike zone. The other thing I like is I really like to use a 1/2-ounce jig in most applications, just about wherever I'm at. The reason is it's a little heavier, and I can feel and keep in contact with the bottom. It's very important when I'm working this bait that I feel and be in contact with the bottom. Every time I feel that thing hit the bottom, I can keep it moving. If I'm using an 1/8-ounce or 1/4-ounce jig, sometimes in a 3/8-ounce jig, if I'm in a little bit of current, I don't necessarily ever feel that bait bump and hit the bottom, but as this half-ounce jig is going through the strike zone and moving around, I'm feeling every little bump, bump, bump. I can feel a log, I can feel the rocks, I can feel the difference when I get a strike. I believe in, especially when I'm fishing tournaments. But I like to have as many advantages as possible when I'm out there fishing tournaments. I like using the scent. Okay, now the scents do one of two things. I get asked all the time, Cooch, do you think the scent attracts the fish or what? I think it's twofold. I think the scent does two things. Number one, when you spray this stuff on, you get it all over your bait, and they're made of a variety of oils. They have the wax type and so forth. When you put this thing out and it hits the water, it emits an oil skid. Okay, and it leaves a bit of a scent trail behind. This is something now these fish are using the sense of smell. They can smell something that is completely, totally natural. So yes, in effect, it can be an attractant to some fish. You get these bigger fish, these 8, these 10, 12, 14 pound fish, they use their sense of smell more than anything. They'll come up on a bait and they'll start sniffing it. If it smells real, you know it looks real, they just suck it right up. And that's all you're going to feel. It's just a little on the end of your line, boom. Then the second part of that scent kicks in. Once they've got that bait in their mouth, they actually taste something in their mouth that is totally real, okay? Whereas if I'm not using the scent, because I'm a smoker, okay? I'm sloppy when I'm putting gas in my boat in the morning. I got these nasty, offensive smells on my hand because I'm always touching my bait on every cast. Those scents are getting onto my bait. And when that bass comes up and he grabs that bait, he goes, spit it out, and you don't even know what hit you. Okay? Whereas when you're using those scents, now I'm getting that scent all over my hand. Okay? It's working out those nasty oils that are offensive to that bass. Now when they grab that thing, they're going to grab it and they're going to go, just like us eating a Big Mac. Okay, that sucker's got some flavor and that's something I'm used to eating. And they're going to hold on to it for a second, maybe 2 seconds longer than the fish that might have tasted those oil or gas.
Right next to him. He doesn't look like he wants to do nothing for me.
Huge. Okay, that 2 seconds to my advantage and yours as an angler is huge because it gives you just that much more time to react and realize that fish is there. So I believe that using scents is extremely important. Now there have been times where I've gone out on the water when those fish are in a positive feeding mode. They're going to hit that bait no matter what it tastes to look like. They're up there feeding, they're hungry, they're going to hit it so hard you're going to know it and you're going to have enough time to set the hook and go on it. I can go out on guide trips in the middle of the week and catch fish like this all week long and never break out a bottle of scent. I turn around getting a tournament on Saturday and Sunday, and all of a sudden now these fish become taste-oriented, and I'll go through 2, sometimes 3 cans of Bang a day. I'll make 3 or 4 pitches, and I'll pick up and spray, put that jig on there. So if you're out there fishing tournaments, I'm highly recommending that you use a lot of scent and use it freely. You're going to find it's going to put more fish in the boat for you. For those of you that are out there that are weekend, mid-weekday fishermen, you're just out there looking, having fun, give the scents a try. If you haven't been using it in the past, if you've been getting bit and not putting fish in the boat, or you've been missing them, use a little bit of that scent on those baits. Those fish are going to hold on to it. You're going to find you're going to put a few more fish in the boat. One of the other techniques that I like going to this time of year, you know, we're in that portion of the spawn where those fish are getting real predictable. They're coming up out of the deep water. They're starting to move into what we call the transition into the spawn. They're coming up out of their deep winter patterns. Okay, and again, deep can be relative. If we're fishing lakes like Shasta, Oroville, Clear Lake, deep can be 25, 35, 45, 60, maybe even 90 feet deep. Okay, out here in the Delta, now we're talking maybe 17 to 25 feet. That's deep. That's real deep on the Delta. When those fish are in that mode, and they're starting to move up and transition into those shallow flat areas, I like going to a little Texas rig. And I start throwing especially on the Delta and Clear Lake, I start going to a 6-inch zipper work. I like giving them something that's got a little bit more body, it's got a little bit more tail action. And for me, I have found with these zippers that black and blue works the best, okay? I've played with some oxbloods and I've played with browns and cinnamon colors and catch a few fish, but I don't have near the success with those kind of baits that I do fishing with this black and blue. There's just something about a black and blue bait that bass just love to key on in the wintertime and the early spring. You go back to your Bassmaster magazines, go back to your FLW Outdoors, you start reading what these guys are using out here on a big time tournament trail and see how many times you see and read about black and blue. There's something about black and blue that these bass just love. I mean, it's a color, it's a trigger color that they just love to fish and eat on. I like fishing these big zipper baits. They're big, bulky baits. They got that big tail that moves, okay, and it gives them a nice, big, large profile. When you're fishing this bait, it nose down. You get the tail that's up in the air and just making short little hops, short little hops. When I'm fishing the Delta, you're down there in the grass, you'll be pulling this thing up through the grass, pulling it up, you'll be in the grass, you'll be feeling the grass, you'll be pulling it up, and the rod will kind of load up, you give it a nice quick little pop, poof! You'll feel that fish grab that bait just as you're coming off the top of that grass. That's where this bait is most effective, especially in the Delta and fishing the outer weed lines up at Clear Lake. When you're fishing around in thick grass lines where you're working a transition bank and you've got a nice 8-10 foot drop, this is an extremely effective bait when you're down there. Now, when I'm using my Texas rigs, I mentioned earlier, I like to try and keep things real simple. I only use solid brown and solid black jigs. My setup here, I'm using anywhere from, sometimes I'll use a 3/8 or a 4 ounce bullet sinker. Okay, I use black, that's all I use. Okay, I don't think that if you're using a blue weight, a red weight, a green weight, that you color and match the weight to your bait makes a whole lot of difference. I really don't. Maybe it makes difference when you're fishing for spots and smallmouth on these foothill lakes all throughout California. Maybe you've got to have one color that's all the same for those fish. Those are a little different kind of bass than what I'm looking for. If I'm up there fishing a tournament on them foothill lakes, I'm looking for largemouth. Largemouth, I catch 5 largemouth, I'm going to beat the guy that catches 5 spots. I catch 5 largemouth, I'm going to beat the guy that catches 5 smallmouth. I don't want to be messing around. And 9 times out of 10, if I get a smallmouth that eats this bait or a spot, he's going to be bigger than most of what you guys got in your sack, okay? Because he's a bigger fish, he's looking for a different type of meal, and I'm offering him something that resembles a bait fish. It's a natural predator and forage in that way. So I like to stick with that black. It's easy to use. I don't think I don't have to worry about color choices. The other thing that I have in there, you'll notice, is I do use a little red bead. I got a little red bead in there, and I think that little red bead is huge. Number one, it's the color red itself, okay? It's a trigger color for bass. Think of a shad. What do they have? Some of them have a little red dot on their eye. They got the little red gills, okay? When a bait fish or a salamander or a lizard or a snake or a bird or a frog is injured, it bleeds red. It's a color that bass trigger on. And I like to have red in every single bait that I throw. So hence, when I'm using this, I'll put that little red bead. Now, these particular red beads that I have on here, they're a top brass bait. I don't know if you guys can see it from there, but as I turn that, there's a little bit of a sparkle on that. You can see it if the light hits it just right. Maybe you'll be able to see that as I'm pulling it through the water. What that is that's a little mylar dot, okay, that is put on that. It's a little pearl kind of dot that's put on that bait. And you can see as I'm bouncing and hopping that thing through the water column, if I've got some sunlight, and that sunlight hits that little spot just right, it's like a flashbulb going off down there to that bass, okay? Remember what I said, we're trying to trigger. Okay, not only am I moving that bait real fast, moving and hopping and popping and trying to trigger reaction strikes, I've got that bead down there that's got that little flash on it that helps me get a couple extra bites a day. That's all I'm looking for. I think maybe I get 5 or 6 extra bites a day versus the guy behind me with this bait, so I like using that bead. I keep it simple. It's the only 2 that I use. I always use that red bead on my Texas rig, and I always use the black weight. Now, sometimes I'll peg my weight, more so in the winter time, transitioning into spring. I want that bait right down there on the head of that worm. Whereas when I'm fishing in the summertime, I kind of want that worm to float and hang a little more. So as I'm pulling it up and over tulies, or as I'm pulling it through the grass, I don't mind if the weight is ahead of the bait and falls and the bait just kind of slowly slithers behind it, okay? I will not peg that weight in the summertime, but in the wintertime and that pre-spawn period, I like pegging that weight so I can keep that weight right there on top of that worm. I want that worm, as it docks, I want it to go nose down on the bottom, because I'm bottom bouncing this time of year with that bait. It's kind of like that jig. I like to have a little heavier weight, something I can keep in contact with the bottom. As far as the hooks that I'm using, I like using Sugoi wide gap worming hooks. Okay, it's a little combination of a round bend hook. It's a Yamamoto product. It's a combination of a round bend hook and a wide gap. It doesn't have as big a gap and rudder action as what you would find in an EWG hook. Yet it's got a little bigger bite than the standard round bend. Now, as we start moving a little further into early March, those fish start getting up on the beds. We came across the bait last year by Andre Moore that I thought, a buddy of mine, Bobby Barrett, showed to me. He threw me a bag of them one day while we were out fishing. I was out there one day on a cold front day in March, and we struggled to catch fish. And he come in with 5 5-pounders and said he caught 35 fish, him and his client. I'm sitting there going, oh, Bobby, don't tell me that fellow, the client. Tell me later when I'm not looking, right? He's not listening. But anyhow, he threw me a couple of these baits. And I took one look at that bait and I said, wow. Okay? The reason I said wow, because now that gives me a plastic bait. It looks just like a crawdad. It's phenomenal how much this bait looks like a crawdad. It's a creature looking like a bait. It's got that little fat profile. Okay, it's a zipper. It's got that wide kind of body. It's a creature where it's got the extra arms. It's got these 2 claws in front. You can fish them open or you can fish them apart. I like splitting them apart. The reason I like splitting them apart because when you start moving that bait, you start getting all kinds of different action out of those tails. Now with this bait, I found that the plastic's pretty tough. It's pretty sturdy plastic. You can catch 10, 20, 30 fish out of one bait. It's real durable. It's not like that Yamamoto bait where, you may only get 3 or 4 fish out of a bait. Or some of these soft plastic hand boards, they eat it once, tear it off, and it's gone. This bait's got real durable plastic. So what I like to do is I like to do what we call exposing. Okay, because a lot of times I found I was getting bit, and when I set, I was having problems getting a good hook set on these fish and getting it to penetrate into their mouth. They were running off and spitting it. Okay, so what I did was I went to a little bigger style hook and I started exposing it. So that hook's just resting in this little V. All of a sudden my hook set ratio went through the roof. Next thing you know, I'm getting bit and I'm catching all of these fish. For guys who are out there fishing the brush hog now, I'm out here fishing this sweet beaver. For me in the river and up at Clear Lake, sweet beaver only seemed to work until about June or July. Then I didn't get the number of bait and the number of bites, and the reason I think that was because, they begin transitioning. You start looking into those bluegills, and what this bait's representing truly is a crawdad. When they're on that crawdad bite, boy, they're going to eat it. I found that in April and May, where this bait worked really good was at night. You get on Amador, you get on Tulloch, you get on Pedro, you get on New Melones, you get on Berryessa, you get on Clear Lake, you're out there fishing at night. If you like fishing plastics versus a jig, this is a great bait to get down on the bottom and bounce on them rocks down in 20, 30 foot of water. those fish at night just really keyed on. We were up in Amador. I was up there with Bobby Tripp. He called me up. We were going to go up and fish on a full moon. One of the first times up there. And we were just going to go up there and go jig fishing for pigs. We called Amador up. No tournaments. Great. Cool. Full moon, right? We get up there. There are 4 tournaments going out of this lake. And Amador's not that big of a lake. Well, we got to deal with what we got to deal with, right, folks? So there's like 60 boats on the lake, and Bobby and I, every point we go to, there's 8 or 9 boats on it. And I'm throwing jigs. Well, I notice everybody else is throwing jigs. They're throwing 10-inch black worms and big buzzbaits. And really, nobody's really getting bit. There's just a lot of pressure. So what I did was I reached down into the box and I pulled out this sweet beaver. And what do you know started happening? All of a sudden, I started catching fish. We'd pull up onto a point where there'd be 8 guys. We'd back 15 feet off away from them, throw out, poof, poof, 18 foot, 25 foot, 40 foot, poof, and all of a sudden Bobby's going, "What you got on there, Cooch?" I said, "Sweet beaver." He said, "Where'd you get that?" I said, "At the store." "Where else?" He said, "Well, how can I get some?" I said, "I got to take it back to the launch ramp, and you got to go to the store." "You think I'm going to give it to you?" He said, "You were going to whoop my butt." I said, "No, you're not tonight." So, and as the story goes, we fished all night long. I caught 27 keeper bass. Biggest one was about 8.5 pounds. And all night long, we'd pull up into a spot, and you could see 8 or 9 boats around there. We'd catch them, and they could hear us out there catching. Me and Bobby are just raging. I finally did give him something. I couldn't, it was so bad, I was so far ahead of him, I couldn't not give him nothing. But he finally started catching some fish, and we were making so much money. We'd catch fish, all those boats would come over to us. We'd just kind of troll the motor back around out to where they were, and boom, all their fun. And then we'd take off and go to the next spot. But this bait, I mean, you're probably going to hear a lot about it this weekend. I know Andre's come out with a new bait. He left some up here on the last time around, and Gary tossed them out. He's got a new version of this bait. I happened to find my way into one, and it's a little bigger version. And the cool thing about these baits, guys, is that they're all 2-tone. I mean, that's the coolest thing, because you look at this bait, on the bottom, it's watermelon green with some green flake, okay? I think this one's called grassy moss. On the top side, it's green pumpkin with some purple flake. If you're fishing those fish that are real color sensitive, and they're on a color, they're on that green pumpkin and purple, and you're down there and you're banging those fish, and you're popping this thing on the bottom, and you're banging those fish, and all of a sudden they shut off, they stop eating. Maybe you've caught the 8 or 9 fish in the area. You can take that bait and turn it around, 180, okay? Take that bait and turn it around, 180, and now you're giving those fish a little bit different look. Okay? Now instead of giving them that purple and that green pumpkin, now you're going to give them that watermelon. You're going to give them that watermelon and that green flake. That green flake now with that sunlight penetration, now you're giving those fish a little something different to look at. This was just a great idea, I think, by Andre, because all of the baits that he makes in this bait, with the exception of the new black and blue one that I saw, where it's all black and it has the blue claws, most of these baits are 2-tone, so you can flip it over and really give the fish a little something different to look at. So a lot of times you'll go through a zone and you'll catch 4 or 5 fish on one side, they'll stop eating it, all you got to do is turn around, flip that bait over, and voila, next thing you know, you're throwing a little different color at them. They can see a little different color. Excellent, excellent bait in the springtime when you're out there fishing for those transitioning fish. I'm sure at times this bait's going to work just about everywhere, but for me, I like using it at night and I like using it in the early spring. Now, when those fish get up into the beds, a couple years ago, Yamamoto came out with that Senko bait, and that has just probably been, in the last 10 years, probably one of the most fish-catching baits that we've ever seen. It's just a big slug of plastic that has this tremendous fall. It's very important with this bait that you fish it on a slack line and you fish it do nothing. Okay? When I'm fishing this bait, 9 times out of 10, all I'm doing is I'm pitching it out, and I'm letting that line go slack, and I just let that thing fall, and I let it fall, and I let it fall. And what happens is that thing is falling like this down through the water column. It gets those fish's attention. Okay? And the key is to let it sit there. Let it sit there as long as you can possibly stand it. You cannot imagine how long you have to leave it there sometimes before a fish will come up and eat it. If you just let it sit there and let it sit, the longer you let it sit there, okay, it's already fell through the water column. It got that bass's attention, and he's sitting there and he's looking at that thing and he's going, it ain't moving. Oh, that's just too doggone easy. It still ain't moving. And he gets a little closer, he takes a little stick, it ain't moving. This gotta be dead. Next thing you know, you see your line jump, all of a sudden your line starts taking off, bang, set the hook. Okay, it's phenomenal. The more that bait sits there, the longer and the higher the percentages that you're gonna get bit with that bait. Now, a lot of times, what I'll do is, especially in the springtime, I'm looking for areas where I think those fish might be spawning. And I'll pitch that thing right up in there to that area where I think it'll spawn, and I'll let it sit, and I'll let it sit, and I'll let it sit. And if I don't get bit, I'll just take that thing and lift it, and then let it sit, and then reel down the slack, and then let it go again. Let it go again, let it go again, let it go again. And just let it sit there, and let it sit there. Are those bass looking at it? Any of those bass down there looking at it? I can't see with the bubble. But you let it sit there. It's going to get the attention of somebody at some point in time. Okay? Now, when I'm fishing this bait, and there are a number of sizes of this bait. I like fishing the larger of the two baits, the 9L, the 6-inch. Remember I talked about hamburgers and hot dogs. Okay? There's some 3-inch, there's some 4-inch, and there's some 5-inch Senkos. And this is the one that's probably the most popular with everybody. You get out there throwing this 9 Series Senko, you're going to catch fish just about any body of water. Anywhere you find, especially in clear water. This is just a deadly bait. It's a little shad colored one, okay? This one's got a little different flow to it. But I think these smaller baits tend to attract the smaller fish. Okay, remember that hot dog T-bone theory. I like presenting that larger style bait to those bass. But this is probably the most common bait that guys use is this 5 Series. I think if you go, you'd be surprised. You go to those 6-inch and those 7-inch Senkos, even those 12-inch bass will eat that thing. They just can't stand it. And the key with those things is with the amount of salt that's in these baits, those fish will grab this thing and hold on to it for a lifetime. Okay? Again, I think it's very important that when you're fishing this bait, you fish it on fluorocarbon line. And the reason is because we're fishing it weightless and we're fishing it as a free-falling bait. And the fluorocarbon is very dense. It will sink with your bait. It's very important that that bait falls parallel to the bottom, okay, on that slack line. And as you're fishing it, that line is sinking with your bait. Whereas with regular mono, that bait's going to kind of fall with a nose upward kind of activity. Okay, it's going to kind of fall like that. And I don't think that's giving you the best possible action. You want that bait falling perfectly flat so that it gets a chance to do that nose to do, nose to do, nose to do action. Another bait, I heard Gary talk about it a little bit before. A new one that Yamamoto came out with last year. And actually, this bait really isn't new. Gary just came out with a couple of different sizes. We've had the 4-inch cut-tail worm for a long time, for about 3 years now. But what he did was he came out with a 6-inch, a 5-inch, and a 6-inch version of this worm. Okay, that's made of the same components. It's got the same density as your Senko. Okay, and I fish it in the springtime the same way. When you rig this thing, I'm using a round band hook. You want to get that thing as straight as possible. Now, I saw this bait and I really fell in love with it because now I got a bait that does a similar thing, but it looks just a little bit different. It's a little bit different fall. There's a little bit different presentation with this bait. So when everybody's out there throwing weightless Senkos, right, and they're going bang, bang, all of a sudden they get off that bite. But I think fish can get conditioned. Bass aren't as stupid as we think they are. They're pretty dumb. They're not stupid, okay? So they'll, after a couple of weeks of 100 guys on a body of water getting ready for a tournament, they're seeing Senko after Senko after Senko after Senko in all the good areas like Frank's Track and Big Break and Little Mandeville and the North End and Lease and Lucerne and Clear Lake, all these great places where we go shallow water fishing in the springtime. They're just sick and tired of seeing Senko. I'm coming in behind everybody with this weightless cut-tail worm and catching just as many fish, if not more. I'm providing a bait that's got a little different action. I fish it a little differently. When I let it hit the bottom, I'll give that thing a few little hop, pop, pops, get that tail going up, get the tail in the back, get the nose lifting, and kind of fish it through that column. This bait I found was real effective for me up at Clear Lake because it really, that green pumpkin bait really looks like that hitch up there. When you put that bait in front of a bass at Clear Lake, it's up there on a bed, getting ready to spawn or transitioning. There's something about that bait that they just can't stand not eating. Okay? And it's just sitting there, it's just sitting there, it's just sitting there. Those fish up there just can't stand this bait. Folks, my name's Andy Cuccia. Enjoyed talking to you today. Thanks for coming out. If you got any questions, I'll be downstairs afterwards.